of course, anger was present back in the day. They wouldn't have revolted against England if they weren't angry. But at the same time, they were really concerned about trying to regulate their anger because they knew that if we just give up, then we're going to be ruled by our passions, whatever angry thought pops into our head.
On this episode of the Psychology Podcast, I chat with my friend A.J Jacobs, a New York Times bestselling author and overall mensch. The topic of our discussion is A.J.'s latest book, The Year of Living Constitutionally. In one sense, A.J.'s book is a crash course in how the Constitution affects our lives and how to interpret it properly. In another sense, his book is an investigation into what it means to live a good life and the best way to pursue happiness. Remarkably, A.J. has spent a full year adopting the tools and mindset of the Founding Fathers, quills and all. It's really incredible what A.J. does when he spends a year exploring something, which he's done over the course of multiple books, but he picks up something different each time. I love all of A.J.'s books, and this one is particularly provocative and enlightening. So without further ado, I bring you A.J. Jacobs. A.J!
Scott Barry Kaufman, I am so delighted to be here.
J!
What a welcome.
J! It's so good to have you back on the Psychology Podcast. You're always welcome on this show.
Well, I am a huge fan not only of the show, but also of you as a human being. You are one of my favorites on planet Earth.
Well, I really
know.
appreciate that. And you've been, and I've been a bigger fan of yours than you've been a fan of mine, technically.
Longer. I wouldn't say bigger, but longer. You had read my books before I had read yours, but now I caught up.
Well, I love these year living ... books. I guess my question is, how literal are you about that? Do you actually, like, 365 days do it? Because, like, there's been times where I've, like, caught up with you within the year of things and you're not wearing your, thing, and, so, like, how does that work?
Right. Well, by the way, I'm going to put I know this is a podcast, but I'm going to put on my tricorn hat just to get into character.
Love it.
Yeah, sometimes they're longer than a year. I did one called Drop Dead Healthy, where I tried to be the healthiest person alive, physically and mentally. And that was at least two and a half years, because I needed a lot of work. That was hard to do in a year. This one actually turned out to be a year because I decided to start it. It's about the Constitution and politics, and I started it on Election Day and ended it on Election Day. So that seemed to work out well.
But how much of your day do you really take it literally for that whole year? Like, I really want to know your normal day when you're in character for this. Like, are we talking like you get dressed up and go to the coffee shop to write, like, and you're in your outfit, you're in your, like, 17th century or whatever outfit? Wait, explain this to me.
Yeah. All right. Well, yes, that is. Well, let me back up and explain the premise, and then I'll tell you how much of my day was taken up, which was all of it.
Yeah.
So the premise is about the Constitution, because I realized the Constitution affects every part of our lives, and I knew nothing about it. I had not read it top to bottom. I knew the preamble from Schoolhouse Rock, but I didn't know much about it. So I thought, let me try to understand it by adopting the mindset and the lifestyle of the Founding Fathers and see what I could learn. So seek what I can learn about politics, and because that is, of course, extremely timely, but also what can I learn? What wisdom is there from our ancestors that I can learn that might make my life better, that might help in my pursuit of happiness, to use their phrase. And also what ignorance I should leave behind, because it was a racist, sexist, homophobe. It was a terrible time in many ways. So I decided to go all in, as I like to do. As you know, that's my MO. I did it with the Bible. I tried to live biblically, and I had the robe and the beard. So this time I had my tricorn hat. I lived by candlelight. I wrote with a quill pen. So I was literally an ink stained wretch because my fingers were constantly covered with black
Did you buy
ink.
a good quill
Um,
pen? I went down the rabbit hole on trying to find the best quill pen I could buy for my own purposes.
and did you find one?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm just wondering which one you got. Let's nerd out on quill pens a
Oh well,
second.
I went full on, which
Oh,
is the actual goose quill. Like
oh,
they're
oh,
ones with ball like that have
oh,
the little
right. That's right.
metal part, but
Yeah,
this is an actual
I
goose
see.
quill.
I see.
So and I bought the feathers and I made it
Oh,
myself because that's what they would have done.
wow.
And then I made the ink out of wasps' nests. So it was a big. There was an element of DIY, and that is one thing that I think was a positive. There are a bunch of positive aspects of
Yeah.
our ancestors that we should, and one of them is being connected to the items around us. So I knew exactly what was in my ink. I made my own pen,
Hmm.
and it was in that sense that was quite lovely.
That is so cool. You did a lot of things. You voted by voice.
I did. That's how they voted. There was no secret ballot and or very rare secret ballot in the 17 and 1800s. People would just go in and you would announce your vote. So I thought I would try to vote that way.
What
I don't
happened?
recommend it. That's
What
not
happened when you tried?
well. Well, I went into my polling station in New York City and I said I'd like to vote for, I guess it was Governor Kathy Hochul, and they said, "Shh, shh, shh, don't say it, don't say it. We're not supposed to talk like that." And I said, "Yeah, but that's the way they did it in the 1790s. I'm trying to recapture that." They said, "Don't." We've moved on. We've moved on, which is a good lesson. In some ways, we have. I will say one thing about elections that is, I think, relevant to your listeners more is about the joy of democracy. Back then, it was a new thing. The ability to choose your own leader, to have a participatory vote, that's an astounding fact that we just take for granted. And so many of us don't vote. So the idea of trying to recapture the joy of
Yeah.
casting a vote. And it was like a festival then. It was like a party, at least for the privileged few who could vote. So it was, of course, racist and sexist,
Right.
but it also had an element of festivity. So there was a lot of rum punch was
Oh.
served and election cakes. So I tried to revive the election
Oh.
cake because there was these cakes that you would come to the vote and you would talk with your friends about politics and you would and that I think is something we should recapture. So that's one of the many aspects of 18th century life that I feel are worthy
Oh,
of
that's so.
reviving.
Yeah. No. No. I love it. I
And
love it.
I got people in every state of the United States to bake election cakes and bring it to the polls, and it was one of the most meaningful experiences, I'm not joking, of my life. It was because I was so depressed by our politics and the divisiveness and a feeling I couldn't do anything. And this one small gesture, and I know it was small, but it, I was able to connect with hundreds of people around the country. We felt like we were doing something active by baking this cake. And, even if it's just giving out sweets to people, it was a reminder that democracy is sweet and we've got to fight to keep it.
Well, yeah, I love it. There's like a lot of ways in which it was better back then. Obviously, a lot of not better for everyone, as you point out, with all those caveats, right? Like slaves weren't partying, right? But
No.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But so all caveats aside, I mean, one thing that seemed to be better back then was the idea that um, the political parties weren't as fractionated and divisive as they are now. That really, really struck me when I read your book. So you think if they saw like the State of the Union address with like Marjorie Taylor Greene or whatever her name is with the Trump hat and like with the booing and would you think that they'd be like what happened?
I think George Washington would be horrified. He hated factions and parties,
Okay.
and he tried to stop them. They came around pretty quickly. And yeah, the Jefferson Adams election of 1800 was quite ugly. But I would say that they weren't as. Right now, what we have is a real rigidity of thinking, and it is really disturbing. As you know, this divisiveness, people are in one camp or the other, and you're supposed to adopt all of the beliefs of your tribe, even though they might be unrelated. You know, what does gun control have to do with abortion? Have to do with not regulating companies? You know, they are
Yeah.
different ideas. So back then, I do think there was more of a open-mindedness to changing your mind, a flexibility of mind.
There you go.
And in fact, one of my favorite anecdotes is that James Madison, the father of the Constitution, his last words on planet Earth were, "I changed my mind."
Wow.
He like made a weird face. I know. We don't know what it
About what?
was.
About what? Yeah.
I don't. I mean, it could be like what kind of tea he likes. It could be the
I
bicameral
I
legislature.
think he
We
was.
just don't know.
I feel like I know what it was. I feel like I know what it was.
Oh yeah, what? Come on, tell me.
No, I think that's obvious that he was referring to his thoughts on religion.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
that is possible.
Yeah.
I mean, but what I love is
Yeah.
that he was open to it, as
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin
Oh, that's my
is my
boy.
favorite founding
That's my
father.
boy. That's my boy right
Yeah,
there. Yeah. Yeah.
he
We would
really
have we
is
would have partied
amazing. I
with
mean,
Ben.
he had
Yeah.
you guys really would have been friends. I
Yeah.
feel that.
Oh
I
yeah.
mean,
You too. You
he
too.
had his flaws. He had his flaws like everyone, but he was by far the most open-minded. And at the Constitutional Convention, he gave a speech at the end saying that the older he gets, the less sure he is of his opinions.
Wow.
And I try to adopt that. I try to adopt that as I get older. Because it's so easy to fall into the older you get, the more sure you are of
Yeah.
yourself, and you surround yourself with people who agree with you, so you become even more set in your ways. But not Ben Franklin, and I'm trying to do what Ben Franklin did.
You know, Ben Franklin has this whole list of virtues that partly forms the basis for the modern day science of character strengths. Partly, and he uses the word trifling a lot. Don't fall prey to trifling. You know, he uses that word a lot in his list of virtues. You talk about just in general with all the founding fathers, they were really into virtue. It's particularly the idea of public mindedness. What would be a modern day understanding of that phrase, public mindedness, that they were so interested in?
Well, yes, they really were, and with the caveats that they had a very small view of what the public was.
Small what?
The
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, go on.
but they really believed that virtue
Yeah,
meant doing good for others, thinking of others first, sacrificing,
I
the
see.
marshmallow test, all that good stuff. And so virtue now, I feel, has a tainted, it's virtue signaling. We use that word a lot to be like, show off how ethical you are, and ask, how were the bees treated who made this honey that you're serving me on my pancakes? But they saw virtue in a different way. They saw it as being concerned for your fellow human. And I love that because we, I feel, are obsessed with the rights in the Constitution, which is great. Which is great. We're all about our own personal right. We should be concerned with individual rights. But I think we have forgotten a lot about the responsibilities and the duty and what you owe to your community and to the world. And they wrote a Bill of Rights. They didn't write a Bill of Responsibilities
Uh-huh.
because people understood the responsibilities. It was so obvious you didn't need to spell it out. But when I wrote a constitution for my For my family, I included a Bill of Responsibilities as well as a Bill of Rights.
Justice, equality, freedom, and liberty.
Absolutely. I mean, they defined them slightly differently, but yes, they cared. I mean, they were trying to create a better world, and they got some things right, they got some things terribly wrong, but they were really trying. They were really trying, and I
Really?
respect them for that.
What did they do to try for equality?
Well, as you point out, they were not obsessed with equality. They had a very blinkered view of equality because
Yeah.
did not include Native Americans, black people, and women. But they rejected monarchy and the
Uh,
idea that the monarch, an
I see.
aristocracy, was born with privileges, and they hated monarchy and aristocracy. And that is something that I wish, that's another thing from that era that we should recapture. Because for
Hmm,
some reason, we're back
interesting.
to being obsessed with, Kate Middleton. We're back to being obsessed with, Prince William or whoever. And the imagery of royalty is everywhere. Like the Burger King. There are all these phrases, king size mattress, queen size mattress,
Oh, it's
the king
true.
of pop. And I
Uh,
think they would have been appalled. They specifically changed the
wow.
names of, like, King's College changed to Columbia College, which you taught at, and King's Street were changed to Congress Street. King's
Hmm.
Minuet Dance was changed to Congress. They hated the idea of aristocracy and this idea that you were born with some sort of advantage. So in that sense, it was revolutionary because every other country had this idea that there was a class who deserved to be higher.
Right. So they did hate nobility and that whole concept of nobility. No, that's a really good point. Yeah. Um, I want to talk about the most recent amendment, which is the result of a crusade by a college student who got a bad grade on his government paper. I didn't know about that.
Yes.
So could you elaborate on
Oh,
that a
it
little?
is hilarious. It is hilarious. Well, I think just to give you some background, I thought one of the conclusions I came away with was everything requires a village, not just a village, a world. Like this book that I wrote could not have been done without researchers and my editor and the hundreds of people I talked to, um, and wisdom like yours. But at the same time, there are cases where one person can make a huge difference in the world.
Hmm.
And I love that. So those are both true. They're a little paradoxical, but they're both true. And in this case, it was a man named Gregory Watson, and this was a few years ago, I think in around 1990, and he was a Texas University student, and he got a bad grade on his essay, and the essay was about a forgotten amendment that James Madison himself wrote in the 1780s. And the amendment was that Congress should not be able to give itself pay raises, that the pay raises will only take effect at the next Congress, which makes sense, like a totally rational, but it didn't pass the required number. You needed 3/4 of the states to sign on, and there were only 13 states at the time, but he didn't get to 3/4. So Gregory Watson wrote a paper saying, I think we should revive this. It makes sense. And it's still alive. It's like a zombie amendment. It never went away. No one ever said no. So let's try to get it through. Let's get the other states. Now you need whatever it was, 30 more states. And his teacher said that's an idiotic idea. And he was maybe, I don't recommend like revenge being a motivator for good, but in this case it worked out. He said, I am going to get this passed. And he spent 10 years sending letters, because it was letters at the time, to state senators all across the country, and eventually it passed. And that is the last amendment the 27th Amendment. And I'm very worried that we're not going to have a 28th Amendment
Oh.
because our country is so divided, and you need some unanimity to get an amendment passed. And I think it's a big problem. I think the the founders did not want the Constitution to be so hard to amend. They did not foresee the divisiveness that would make it so hard to amend, because they were Enlightenment thinkers. They knew that we make mistakes, and they knew we would need to revise. So they were much more flexible and open in some ways than we are now.
Well, let's see what other wisdom we can learn from the founding fathers. Tell me more about their thoughts on slowing down, because that seems so relevant to our culture today.
Oh yes, I loved this. Was one of the biggest lessons of my experience is we need more cold takes and fewer hot takes. We are a hot take culture, and it is
It's true.
terrible. I mean, and one way that I experienced this, because as you know, I was wearing my tricorn hat, I was living by candlelight, and I wrote instead of on my computer or on my iPhone, I would write with my quill pen. And writing with a quill pen actually changed the way I thought because it
Hmm.
slowed me down. So instead of texting something, and sending it off immediately, you have to sit down, you have to get out the ink, you got get out the quill, and then you write your thoughts. You're able to think about it. It's a longer format. And before you send it, you have to, I would put wax on it. So it was like a waiting period for my thoughts, which is great because I think thoughts need a waiting period. They need to slow down instead of just spewing out the first thing that comes into your mind, which is causing so much of the conflict that we have today, is that we're not able to use some self control. They were very into self control and governing your passions.
Yeah, for sure.
Stoicism. They were very influenced by Stoic thoughts. So I think that is something we need to recapture. And I don't recommend that we all go back to quill pens, but I do recommend maybe try writing by longhand, or
Hmm.
don't send your send give a waiting period for your emails or texts. Type them up and then wait a couple of minutes before you send them. It just is so important, and I do think they thought more deeply then, and they it was weird. If you Politicians today, you don't hear them talking about political philosophy and ethical philosophy
Mm.
like they did back then. They were really remarkable in that way.
Yeah, it just really struck me reading your book, the benefits of not living in such a digital age. You've already mentioned some of the benefits, but I think about others. Like you talk in your book about the value they placed on assembling in person, face to face to hash out ideas. I mean, that's just you don't see
Oh
that these
yeah.
days. It's like Twitter discourse would probably be very, very confusing to them and frustrating. Would you agree?
Oh, they would have been appalled by Twitter. Yeah, by
Yeah.
the how and yes, absolutely. One of the rights in the Constitution, in the First Amendment, is the right to assemble. So
Mm.
I tried to express my right to assemble by I had an 18th century dinner party or two where I would cook 18th century food like beef stew and rice pudding, and we'd have Madeira and grog and all this. And but I invited people from all over the political spectrum, and there were like 12 of us, and we sat down and we had a civil discussion
Mm.
about what we like about the Constitution, what we like about America and democracy, and what needs to be changed. And of course, there were disagreements, but no one was yelling or throwing
Right.
alcohol at each. It was really remarkable. And everyone emailed me after what a meaningful experience it was, because like you say, if they had done it over Twitter, it would have just been a bunch of
Disaster.
capital letters, and yeah, it would have been a disaster. So there's that, yeah, and also another digital danger I feel is the news that is piped into our brains 18 hours a day,
Mm,
and the news already has a negative bias
mm.
because who wants to read about all the fires that were prevented? You want to read about the one fire that burned a house down. So I found it extremely troubling for my own mental health to have this news have negativity in my face all the time. They would get the newspaper 2 to 3 times a week, and that was it. And the news was much less biased towards the negative. I remember I spent my time reading newspapers from the 1780s because it was fascinating. I loved this article where they talked about this amazing new innovation of numbers on houses.
Wow.
So instead of saying like it's the house near the big manure
Right.
pile
We can
when you go
precisely.
past the windmill.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just just that made me realize how much we take for granted too, which is another like profound lesson for me. Is I take so much for house numbers. I take socks for granted. I
Yeah.
would wear these.
Yeah.
I tried to dress like them, so I had my tricorn hat, and I would wear these socks, but they were knitted socks, wool knitted socks that went up to my knees, and they didn't have elastic. And when you don't have elastic, the socks sort of slide down and form a puddle around your ankles. So every day you have to put on not garters. They're sort of like garters, but they're not even as sophisticated. They're little belts. They look like belts for tiny people. And you have to put a belt around your sock so it doesn't slide down your leg. And that took a lot of time. So I will never take elastic for granted again. And or the dishwasher, the amount of time that you spend think about trying to wash dishes like they did. It's not just in the sink. They didn't have water in their kitchen. They would have to go out to the well, get a bunch of water, bring it back, or bring the dishes there, and to use things like vinegar and sand to try to clean it off. They were working on every part of life required steps and preparation that we can't even imagine.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of profound things there about the things we take for granted, which really dovetails nicely with your prior book on gratitude. I think that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry. I was going
No.
to say, which quotes one of my favorite psychologists and philosophers, Scott Barry Kaufman,
Oh,
who, yeah, you had some great things to say about savoring and slowing down time in the gratitude book. So I am grateful for you.
well, I'm very grateful that you solicited a quote in the first place. So thank you.
And you're in my puzzle book. I quoted you in my puzzle book.
Oh, that's right.
So
That's
yeah,
right. Well, no,
you didn't make this one. I'm sorry. I am sorry.
yeah.
If you had,
No, it's okay.
if you were from the 18th century, I would have
Yeah,
quoted you.
yeah, yeah. It wasn't as relevant, but no, I have a lot of I have a lot of gratitude that you considered me a worthy source. Yeah,
Of course.
this one there's a lot of little quirky things in this one as you are, and like the pillory. Like you bought a wooden pillory off Etsy. They actually sell it.
Oh yeah, that was a bizarre one, and this was because the one of the goals of the book was to try to express my rights the way they were expressed in the 1780s. So when instead for my First Amendment freedom of speech, I wrote with a quill. I wrote pamphlets and handed them out on the street instead of writing tweets. Now, the Eighth Amendment of the Constitution says that there should be no cruel and unusual punishments.
Mm.
And at the time, in 1789, what they considered cruel and unusual was very different from what we consider cruel and unusual. So something like the pillory was considered just fine. So it made me realize how much we have evolved morally. Like there is a lot of
Yeah.
pessimism out there, but so yeah, and a pillory, as you might know, or is a wooden contraption where you put your arms and head in, and you would be in the town square, and it was awful. It was just, I mean, it's not like where you go to Williamsburg and take a photo. It was people were throwing rocks at you. They were throwing dung in your face. They were hitting you, and it was, it was truly. And I do not like shame-based punishment. I think it is a terrible thing. I think that's another problem with digital culture, has brought back shame-based punishment, like on the internet.
I
That
agree.
book by John Ronson,
I
yeah,
agree.
it's terrible. So we have a digital pillory now. At least we don't have a physical one. But anyway, I just sort of on a lark, I bought a pillory from a place that sold it. They sold more like it wasn't a punishment. It was more for adult dungeons of people who enjoy
Pleasure.
that,
Pleasure.
like
You can just say
pleasure.
yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. It was for pleasure. And I bought it and they sent it to me. One irony is that they said, "Do you want a neoprene padding around the neck hole to make it more comfortable?" And I said, "Well, that kind of defeats the purpose of the pillory, right?" Uh, I I wouldn't put it on anyone but myself. I
Okay.
because it would just feel weird to me. But I did put myself, I had my wife lock me in the pillory for a few minutes just to try to get a sense of what it might feel like. And it was, at first I was giggling. It was so silly and absurd. And then I started to feel like a little bit unnerved by my lack of ability to move. And yeah, so she let me out. I had to promise to fold my sweaters, so she used it as a bargaining chip. And but it was, I guess, the lessons were again how far we've come in punishment, and we still have a long way to go. And also, yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you can buy this on the internet for people who like it, but I'm glad that it's not used as something. At least in our country, I know that there are parts of the world where things like that are still used, and that is something we need to
Yeah.
work on.
But you didn't go out in public and do public shaming.
Not with that. I mean, originally I thought about it, but I thought that's that's enough. I mean, I did a lot of other things in public that were crazy
Yeah,
and
tell us.
I mean,
Tell us. Yeah.
I bore a musket. That was one of them because the Constitution talks about the right to bear arms, and at the time in 1789, arms were mostly muskets. They also had some others, but so I thought, well, what would it feel like to walk around New York City's Upper West Side bearing a musket? And it was weird. It was weird. It was I was I got a lot of people who steered away. Who like I mean I'll give you one advantage is I went into my coffee shop and I was waiting in line and the guy in front of me said, "You go first. I don't want to hold you up. I don't want to hold up a guy with a musket. You go first."
Hilarious.
So it did have
Did he say
that
that? Did he
advantage.
say that?
Oh yeah, no, he was like,
Okay. Okay.
"You go first, man. I not with that thing. I do not want to be in front of you." So that was nice, but the bigger point was how how should we think about the Second Amendment? I don't have any concrete answers, but it gave me some perspective. The question is how it is such a different weapon than a semi-automatic gun nowadays. So, at what point does it become so different that the laws don't apply in the same way? It's like if you write a law for a bicycle, and then we invent a massive truck. At what point do we need a different law? So that was what, and I actually, with the musket, I I used it. I went out a few times. First, I joined a Revolutionary War reenactment group, which was fascinating and wonderful.
Ah.
And I went and I fought in the Battle of Monmouth in New Jersey, the reenactment. I died for our country.
Oh.
I was shot by British troops, but I died in the shade, and it was like kind of restful, so it wasn't so bad. But I also went to a shooting range with my regiment of reenactors, and shooting a musket is fascinating because it is 15, 18 steps. You have to bite off the top of a piece of paper and pour the gunpowder down. You have to pull back all sorts of gadgets. It is not something you can do. It took me many minutes. In the Revolutionary War soldiers could actually do 3 or 4 shots a minute, which is remarkable. But that's still quite different from today's guns, where you can shoot dozens of rounds per minute. So it was anyway. The whole thing was fascinating, and I tried to present a balanced view of gun rights. I mean, I am
Yeah.
sort of a default liberal, so I do believe in more restriction and more regulation, I guess I should say. But I didn't want to just preach to the choir. I wanted to explore these issues in a way that people on both sides would stop and think and slow down, like we said, and slow down and try to come to a a solution that that is workable and that will make the world better.
Yeah. Well, I love that. Oh, I love that. Well, any kind of last ideas regarding what you've learned from them about human psychology, wisdom on how to live your best life?
Well, one, I mean, just to stress that helping others was such a huge part of the way they saw life, and the idea of sacrifice and regulating your emotions. I mean, I think that anger, it's complicated because of course anger was present back in the day. They wouldn't have revolted against England if they weren't angry. But at the same time, they were really concerned about trying to regulate their anger because, like they would regulate the government, they wanted to control their passions. And they knew that humans are, if we just give up, then we're going to be ruled by our passions, whatever angry thought pops into our head.
Yeah.
And George Washington is famous for this because he was born with a temper. That guy, but he spent all of his life working to control his temper. And there's one story, which I think is true. It's not like one of the apocryphal chopping down the cherry tree stories. This one, according to historians, actually happened where it was very early in his political life, and one of his opponents hit him physically with a stick, with a hickory stick. And the next day, Washington asked the guy to meet him at a tavern. The other politician figured they were going to have a fight, a real knockdown, drag-out fight, but instead, Washington extended his hand in friendship and said, let's forgive and forget and take the high road. And
Wow.
that is just amazing. I mean, that is
Amazing.
something that
I love that.
I try. Yeah, it's great. So controlling, I mean, as I say, anger has its positives. Righteous anger, we need to be righteously angry about something, but not volcanically angry and
Yeah.
maybe thoughtfully. Let's be thoughtful about it. And instead of focusing on the anger, focus on solutions, focus on how can we make things better.
I love that. I think we should end on that note. And in that spirit, I shall extend my hand to you, AJ.
I am
Thank
extending
you.
my hand as
Thank you
well,
for all
Billy.
the preparation notes you gave me to this interview, and I enjoyed reading the book as well, and found this one fascinating. I guess I do actually do want to ask you one more question. I was going to leave, but I thought of another question I want to ask you.
Great. I'm here.
Out of all of, how would you rank the top three of all of the living a year things? Like, where does this one rank in all of them? Was this one of your
Oh, well,
favorites, or yeah?
This was one of my favorites just because A, I got to learn so much. B, it was so relevant because every day there's another news story about the Constitution that's going to change our lives and change the policy. So I loved some of writing by candlelight. Candles are lovely. Candles are underestimated. We should do more of that. So I would put it in the top three. Certainly the Bible one. I spent a year trying to live by all the rules of the Bible, and some of that was horrible. Like I had a very itchy, scratchy beard practically down to my navel. I had to, it was, I couldn't touch my wife during certain times of the month. So it had its huge downsides. But at the same time, I learned a lot about gratitude and humility from that project, and ritual, the joy of ritual. And then I guess the third of my favorite was the gratitude book, featuring Scott Barry Kaufman.
Stop
And
it.
I loved that. Just because that, I still work every day at trying to be grateful for all the hundreds of small things that happen instead of focusing on the three or four that go wrong, all the small things that go right, instead of the three or four that go wrong. And it's a daily struggle, but it really improves my life.
Yeah, there's a exercise in positive psychology, three good things before you go to bed that you write down.
Mm,
Well,
love
hey
it.
man, this was really another elucidating conversation. Do you know what your next year, living a year, is going to be like?
I don't. I need a break. I need to, I need a little. I'm doing, as you know, The Puzzler, which is a podcast and which Scott was a wonderful guest on. So
You're
listen for
so kind.
that.
You're so
And,
kind.
so yeah, that's a daily podcast. So that keeps me busy.
You are such a good friend, AJ. You really are such a good friend.
Right back at you. Right
Really,
back
really,
at you.
really appreciate you. Well, all the best on this book tour. Really enjoyed this book, as I enjoy all your books, quite frankly. And I wish you all the best with it.
Thank you, Scott. You too.